Today's topic is a history of a particular Reformed Baptist church that I love to call Mercy Baptist Church. We're going to overview a historical sketch of our church and how we fit into the Reformed Baptist resurgence, if you will. Much of this comes from the sketch I did for the 50th anniversary celebration in late 2021, for those of you who are here for that. So in other words, I'm gleaning information from other people. I only have experience from myself for the last 7.5 years, not 50 years. But nevertheless, I hope this is an accurate account or sketch of our church. We are Mercy Baptist Church. In case you hadn't thought about it in this way, we are not a building, although it's not wrong to refer to the church as a building, but we are primarily a people among whom God has done wonderful things. Anybody know how many names our church has had over its 52-year history? Anybody know? How many names have we had? Higher? Higher? 5, yeah. Mercy Baptist Church is the 5th name.
One for every decade. What was it before the community?
We'll talk about all of those today. We're still the same church family, and that's important to remember that the church is not just an organization, although we certainly hope that we are organized. We are an organism, a church family. So that means that just like in your family, you consider grandpa or great-grandpa as part of your family, but then he passes on. Well, it's still your family. And then you get old and you have your own grandkids, and that's still your family. And so in a similar way, this is our church family's history. Most of you are not going to know many of the names that we were talking about here, but they are kind of like your ancestors in a way of speaking, your spiritual ancestors here at our church. But even though we weren't there, I'm going to still refer to our church as we and not they, because we are the people that God has covenanted together, even though none of us were here 52 years ago. When Tom Wells, our founding pastor, did a history of the church in 1990, when we first moved into this building, he said it's hard to do a history of the spiritual things God has done. So what I'm going to do is overview some of the more tangible elements of our church, such as locations, names of the church, leaders, some of the backgrounds and the transitions and the changes we've gone through. And in that, you'll hear both successes and disappointments. Every church, especially a church that's existed for a long time, has its ups and its downs. So we have our good times and our bad times over 52 years. Sin always sneaks into our midst, even among godly people. Yet in the end, this is a story of God's providence, of His grace, and yes, even His mercy. So we began as Forest Park Community Church in January 1971. That's the first church name, 1971. I don't totally understand the scenario, but it's something like Missionary Baptist Church in Cincinnati planted us with Tom Wells as its founding pastor, but then itself closed. So the dawn of Forest Park Community Church was the end of Missionary Bible Church. I'm not totally sure how that works. At the time, Tom was working at a bookstore at Dallas Seminary in Texas, but he desired to pastor again. He had pastored previously, but he wanted to pastor again. So this church, Missionary Baptist, asked him to serve on staff for a summer while the pastor was out of town, with the potential of being an associate pastor after that. And then it gets a little hazy here, but the plan was to sell the Missionary Bible Church building and relocating while simultaneously taking other people to plant this new church, Forest Park Community Church. But they were not able to sell their building right away, and meanwhile, Forest Park Community Church, that's us, were succeeding. So at that time, Forest Park Community Church had up to 75 members, which in a short period of time, that's pretty impressive. But Missionary Bible Church closed and ended up joining Forest Park Community Church. So that's all the sense that I can make of it. There's more details, I'm sure, but that's all I can figure out. But along that same time, 6 families were transferred away because of work. So it became a pretty dicey situation. Is the church going to survive? Suddenly, they couldn't afford both the parsonage that they had purchased for the pastor. Parsonage is a house for the pastor. And pay rent at the building where they were worshiping. So they stopped worshiping at the elementary school and then started worshiping at the house. But you can imagine with dozens of people, that's going to get real tight real fast. So then we went downtown to become more centrally located. That's a little bit of the location there. And then shortly after its founding, through Tom Wells' leadership, we became more reformed in our convictions as we examined Scripture. And some of these names will ring a bell to you because we've already talked about them. Al Martin, who was a Reformed Baptist pastor in New Jersey, he was influential. Puritan books, such as Banner of Truth publisher, and even something at the time which don't exist anymore called Bunyan conferences. And they were Reformed conferences named after John Bunyan, the Puritan. So in light of those newfound convictions, in 1974, we changed our name from Forest Park Community Church to Reformed Bible Church. And that was about the same time that we adopted the Second London Confession of Faith. So we're coming up on our 50th anniversary next year of adopting the London Confession of Faith. But they also changed the name for another reason. Remember, they had moved locations. So they're no longer in Forest Park. It's hard to be called Forest Park Community Church when you're no longer in Forest Park. So they changed the name to Reformed Bible Church because Reformed theology was very rare in Cincinnati at that time. We originally met in an elementary school in Forest Park, as I mentioned, then later in 2 different homes in which Tom and his family also lived, and where we met until 1986. I also have to mention another key name in here, and that is of Cliff Scholes. I don't think anybody in here got to meet him. You came right after. He died in January 2018, so you guys were here right after that. Cliff Scholes, in those early years, became the treasurer and deacon, roles in which he served for 40 years until his death in 2018. And prior to Alex and Liam, he was the only deacon the church had ever had, which is still odd to me, but that's what it was. And I got to serve with him as an officer from 2015 until 2017 when his health declined and he really couldn't do his duties anymore. He was in a hospital and then in a nursing home. I also have to mention Newton Bush. During those early years, Tom Wells' friend Newton Bush became a pastor and elder. He was in Lima, Ohio, if I remember right, up north, and eventually got his doctorate from Dallas Theological Seminary and came to be part of our church and an elder here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1980, so this is 9 years after the church's founding, Tom Wells actually resigned as pastor due to disagreements with the church about its direction. Remember, this is before we moved into this location. So a man named Earl Bird became the pastor from 1980 to 1984. And at that time, Earl led us to become not Reformed Bible Church, but Reformed Baptist Church. But then Earl left. He was there for 4 years and left. And then, interestingly, Tom Wells came back to pastor the church after Earl had left. And this is where Newton comes into play, where he had finished up his seminary training, getting his doctorate, and then he previously pastoring elsewhere, and then he eventually came back to pastor alongside his friend Tom. So in the late 1980s, we sold the house that was on Hamilton Avenue where we had been worshiping, and then we once again met in an elementary school, this time moving out into the suburbs into Westchester. All the while, we were building this particular building on this lot. The lot was purchased in 1987, and we officially moved into the church building in April of 1990, at which point we changed our name to the King's Chapel. The King, ''S, Chapel. That's important because people thought that, I got this all the time. when I was pastoring the King's Chapel, that we were over by like Kings Island and Kings Mills area. They thought King's Chapel meant Kings over there. No, it's King apostrophe S. And very confusing. During that dedication service in May 1990, we had a guest speaker whose name might be familiar to some of you theologians, Dr. Bruce Waltke. And we sang a bunch of songs that we are still familiar with here at our church. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, a mighty fortress is our God, and can it be? Tom and Newton served together as pastors and elders until Tom's retirement in 2008. And by the way, Newton Bush compiled his and Tom's and other elders' sermons over decades from cassette tape to digital format. So if you ever want to hear a passage taught or preached on from one of those two or other men in our church, I have a hard drive full of them. Allie?
Do we know where the King's Chapel came from? It seems so random to go from.
Great question. Where did the King's Chapel come from? Supposedly, Tom came up with the idea by himself. He liked the idea of the majesty of the king, and he thought church sounded too grandiose or something like that. But it's a historical name that you'll find even in Britain and New England, going back 300, 400, 500 years. So I suspect that maybe in Tom's travels or in his speaking or at conferences, he saw the name somewhere and thought, hey, that's unique, that's interesting. And then also the fact that in our area, and I've never seen this in any other area, they call churches chapels. Usually in other parts of the U.S. where you go, if something is called a chapel, it's not a church, it's just a place you go to like get married or have a ceremony or have an event or something like that. But here in the area, such as Valley Chapel Community Church in Fairfield or Bible Chapel of Delhi Hills, is seen as a church. And so it's a great question because I have to answer that question a lot. So Newton then continued to pastor after Tom's retirement in 2008 when he finally retired in 2015. There have been other elders besides those two men, such as Ed Gonzalez, who is one of the founding elders, Brad Garrison, who's now an elder at Pleasant Ridge Baptist Church, and Mark Weaver, who last I heard attends Primitive Baptist Church. So I can't tell you how thankful I am for solid, faithfully godly pastors that preceded me. It laid a great foundation for my pastorate. For instance, I didn't have to come into a church that was dealing with some scandal or something like that, like some of my friends have had to deal with. It was just godly faithfulness until both of them retired. But then in 2015, early 2015, Newton retired, and the church was without a pastor for about 10 months until I came in late 2015. But they discovered a challenge in there in mid-2015 that they, at that point, had never had a formal membership. So unlike your SBC churches, which have a membership, but it doesn't really mean much because you never remove anybody from the rolls and you have 500 people on your membership rolls, but only 30 attend. We had just the opposite problem. We just had attenders who were members, but never actually an official, formal membership. So in mid-2015, a formal membership was established for a big and good reason. What's the big and good reason that they had to establish a formal membership for the first time?
They needed to figure out who was allowed to vote for their new pastor.
Who's going to vote for the new pastor? It's kind of hard to figure out who that's going to be. Now, granted, you can kind of figure it out by who's generally attending, but they realized that this is something they needed to shore up. At that time, I was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania at Grace Baptist Church, and I was finishing up a pastoral internship there, and so I had found out about the church from a friend who was on a message board for FIRE, if you know that organization, Fellowship of Independent Reformed Evangelicals, and he passed it on to me and said, hey, I know you're looking, why don't you reach out to them? So I interviewed on the phone and in person twice with Peter Flynn, Cliff Scholes, and Brad Garrison. And one time I came by myself, and the other time I came with Megan and a very newborn Clark, which I don't recommend moving with a newborn, by the way. So in late 2015, the church called me to be the new pastor, and at that point, since I wasn't ordained yet, we had an ordination service and an installation service, if you're familiar with those, that tradition, in early 2016. But what do you do if you don't have any elders? How do you lay hands on a man when there's no elders in the church? So what we did was we got Eric Sipe, who was my pastor in South Carolina for a time. Gordon Taylor, who was at the time the coordinator of ARBCA, Association of Reformed Baptist Churches in America. Cliff, our deacon at the time, and Brad Garrison, a former elder. They laid hands on me. Then we went through another name change a few years ago, 2020. In 1990, at the building dedication, Tom said, "We hope this is the last name change for a while." And sure enough, it lasted for 30 years. 30 years, 1990 to 2020. In summer 2020, we changed our name another time. This is now the 5th time. To Mercy Baptist Church because it better reflects who we are and what we believe. We are a church, not a chapel, but a church, what the Bible calls a family of believers in one particular place. We are doctrinally Baptist. That's important, that people know what we believe. And we are recipients of God's mercy. And that was 2020. Raise your hand if you were here in 2020 when that transpired. You weren't a member yet. Were you guys members yet? Didn't?
I think we came on the first, right?
Yeah, it was like the same day. I think it may have been the same day. Yeah. That sounds right. Did you have a question, Ethan? Okay. So there were some theological changes that have occurred in our church over the years. Tom, as I mentioned, led the church to accept as its doctrinal foundation the London Confession of Faith around 1974. But at that point, there were no associations or networks or anything like that around. They literally did not exist yet. And so he could not join them. Our church could not join them because there were none to join. But then when associations did come around, Tom had his own theological idiosyncrasies, and so that prevented him from joining the only Reformed Baptist association around, ARBCA, at the time. He was a proponent of what is called New Covenant theology, or you might have heard of its successor, progressive covenantalism, very similar slants to theology. And because of that, he disagreed with our confession of faith on 2 or 3 different sections. And so because of that, ARBCA would said, no, you're not confessional. And he loved to banter about his theological positions, from what I hear. For instance, when he wrote a book on the Sabbath, he sent it to every ARBCA pastor in the network to try to persuade them. He has an essay in one of the books that I have by him, which, by the way, he has 12 or 13 books that he authored. He has an essay in there about why an association should use a point system as to how to determine confessionality. As you can imagine, it didn't go over. But I admire his tenacity. He really wanted to be in an association. Because of Tom's exception to the confession at that point, our church members were not required to subscribe on those particular points, which is why you see some things in our Constitution about allowances for exceptions on certain areas. Also, Tom and Newton as well did not believe in a formal church membership. They didn't believe that membership was a biblical concept. And in some ways, it was a reaction or a response to some of the SBC abuses, as I mentioned earlier. And also, the Bible church movement tended to prioritize decisionalism. You walk the aisle, and then you become a member of the church. And it happens in a flash. And Tom wasn't keen on that idea, which I agree with him on that. Nevertheless, the King's Chapel, we had to exercise church discipline, which that would be really hard if you don't have membership. But somehow they managed to do it when a wife and mother of 5 kids left her husband and the father of their kids. So I think the church was being biblical as much as it could or knew how to at the time. So when it comes to the church membership and Tom's exceptions on theology, to combine those 2 concepts, I'm told that when asked about church membership, Tom would wink and say, well, it's like the confession. I take an exception on the Sabbath, so why can't I take an exception on our Constitution and not have a membership? So in other words, Tom himself was unconstitutional because our Constitution has had membership written in it for decades. Now, it may have been that the Constitution was formed during the time period when he was not the pastor. I'm a little fuzzy on the details there. Maybe if he had been overseeing the addition of the Constitution, he might not have included a formal membership. But thankfully, when it comes to his theological views, especially on the law and the Sabbath, they didn't seem to translate into a soapbox from the pulpit. He seemed to teach very unbiased and balancedly in his preaching and teaching, although I hear he did emphasize this a little bit more as he got older. The archives that I have of sermon recordings shows an expositional approach to preaching and teaching. In fact, from what I understand, Tom was preaching expositionally and Calvinistically before nearly any other Cincinnati area church. So if you talk to any Reformed-leaning church in our Cincinnati area today, they will have in some way, shape, or form been influenced by Tom because he was the first of its kind in this area. But he was a prominent speaker. Interestingly, he traveled 1 or 2 Sundays a month to preach at other churches, something that I have no interest in doing. Tom switched the church from the King James to the NIV in 1978 when the NIV came out in 1978. But he used the NASB for study. So that was his primary preaching translation starting in 1978. If you've been in our church long enough, you know that our church has had a missions conference. Some of you attended them. They used to be every year, but then COVID just kind of knocked us off kilter, and we've had to focus on other things. But our church still is passionate about and prayerful for missions. For instance, I am told that prior to my arrival, the church was expending upwards of $80,000 a year toward missions advances, which you can imagine a small church like ours, that is a lot of money. So for almost 30 years, we had annual missions conferences to celebrate what God is doing in other parts of the world. I know this is kind of out of order here because I'm combining multiple documents, but Tom is also a hymn writer, interestingly. He wrote a hymn for every missions conference, or at least most missions conferences, starting in 1982. He had one called The Sovereign God, which is probably his most familiar one. Some of our sister Reformed Baptist churches have sung that, and we've sung it here. Alex?
Didn't we sing that for the 50th anniversary?
We did indeed. Yep, The Sovereign God. I don't remember the rest of the lyrics, but there was other ones called Lord Grant Us Courage, Arise, O Church, Christ the Light of the World, and so on. He was an active writer. He contributed to 13 books or booklets, and his most famous one is probably New Covenant Theology, co-authored with Fred Zaspel, but it also could be A Vision for Missions, published in 1985 by Banner of Truth. John Piper, for instance, quotes that book in his book on missions. And I have a collection of them if you want to see what they look like. And Tom retired in 2008, and he and his wife went to another church. I think they went to Faith Bible. I could be wrong. And then they came back after a while to attend before eventually she died, and he moved to Aliquippa, Pennsylvania to live with his daughter Christine and her family. After Tom's retirement in 2008, Newton essentially became the lead elder, the main pastor. He was bivocational in a sense. He was not only a pastor here, but he was also a Bible professor at a school that no longer exists called Temple Baptist College. And Newton was getting older and realized that he needed to resign or retire at some point. So the three elders devised a plan to bring someone in to replace Newton. This is Brad, Newton, and Mark. And in the process, a replacement was never found. There's lots of backstory there, but I won't get into that. So Brad and Mark left independently of each other in 2013 or so, 2012, 2013, and then Newton served faithfully until 2015. And then as of 2015, there were just 10 members left. The only ones that you would know are is Roberta. She's the only remaining attending member. Peter Flynn was also among those, but he's not attending currently. And then Chris Pullman was also attending, but he wasn't a member. He joined in 2016 or 17, somewhere in there. And I came in 2015. Some of this is over a review. Okay. We have enjoyed, even since I've come, to have support and cooperation with fellow Reformed Baptist churches. We used to have the Reformed Baptist Missions Service representative come to missions conferences in the 1990s. Then we had the ARBCA coordinator, and now we've had the coordinator of RBNet, Reformed Baptist Network, come several times. And then in 2019, our church officially joined the Reformed Baptist Network for these reasons. And we often hold joint services several times a year with these sister churches, which I just love seeing these sister churches have fellowship together. Attendance-wise, our attendance has ranged from as low as a dozen or so to as many as over 100 during some of its early years at elementary schools, with an average attendance being in the 40s. So I'd say we're probably about average right now for our church's history. We've always enjoyed singing rich hymns and psalms, both old and new. Tom wrote hymns, I wrote hymns. I like to have us sing new hymns that are not in our hymnals. We currently use 2 hymnals in tandem, Trinity Hymnal, 1990, and Sing the Wonders, first edition from 2016, I think. And then we'll add occasional inserts as we need to. We added back in a prayer time into the life of the church. We've added in Wednesday night Bible studies, and we've added in men's and women's Bible studies as well. And most of that you've seen change since you started coming here. So it's amazing, and we thank the Lord for this, that we have seen God work over 5 decades at our church. The gospel has been faithfully proclaimed from 1971 until today. There are many believers over 5 decades who have learned the scriptures through the preaching and teaching at this church. Since I've been here, I've baptized, I think, 5 different people, which Nathan's one. Ethan, no, 6. I think I've done 6. Roberta's not here, but I've done like 6 baptisms in my time here. And we've had numbers join the membership. The gospel has been forwarded to the farthest regions of the world through our prayer and support. And I would say, if I had to characterize or describe our current state, that we are unified and loving, and at least you all, anyway, are humble. Can't speak for myself. Old and young. Some are new to church, new converts. Some are new to Reformed theology. Others are familiar and attended church for a long time and are very familiar with Reformed theology. You all, for your own encouragement's sake, are eager for the word, and I am blessed with having a congregation who loves to hear the word preached and taught, and you are willing to serve, increasingly so. So what would you add to our church's history since you've been here? You've been here since 2018, 2019-ish, 2020. What would you all add to our church's history since you've been here? What? The baby boom? Yeah. Yeah, that's another story. We've had, when I first came, it was just Clark, and then Hudson, and then Jonah, and then it was like, and we just exploded. So, any other things you would add to our church's history since you've been here? We switched our Bible translation again. When I came, Newton, by the way, taught and preached from the New King James. So Tom used the NIV, the older NIV edition. Newton used New King James. Brad Garrison and others used the New American Standard. When I came, I used the NIV 2011, but then for various reasons, I switched to the CSB in 2021. First ever VBS this summer, here in a month or so. What else would you add to our church's history?
I missed the year that Tom came back.
1984.
1984.
Mm-hmm.
So he left at 80.
80 and came back, and it was like 3.5 years, 4, something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was some sort of disagreement about hymnals or something like that. So even hymnals can cause debate in churches. Other issues or news that you would add to our history? Family time, yep. The church luncheon, monthly church luncheon has always been here, but I added family time, which is conversation for miscellaneous things between pastor and congregants. Let me close with this. 2023, which is where we are, is not the end of our church, praise the Lord. It's proper to speak about it in these terms. Don't boast about tomorrow, for you don't know what a day might bring. Proverbs 27. So that means that when it comes to our church, we better think of it in terms of like a tombstone, where you have date, dash, date. We just don't know what the second date will be. It's 1971 to blank. Our church will fail. But we can thank the Lord that His church, capital C church, will not fail and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. To that end, we request prayer among ourselves, and we do pray, for continued peace, love, and unity, for spiritual growth and numerical growth for that matter, and then additional officers, especially elders, to serve alongside me and Alex and Liam. Anything else you all would add to that?
2020 we started streaming services.
Oh yeah, 2020 we started live streaming. That was a big change. And church's first pandemic. True indeed. All right. Unless there's something else, let me pray. Father, thank you for giving this church life, and even in some ways revitalizing and rejuvenating it in 2015 when the numbers had gone so low. Our hope is not in numbers. Our hope is not in the different physical aspects of our existence, but is only in you, in your Son's work through us. So do so for your glory, for His honor. In Jesus' name, amen.